In the sun-baked land where the days were hot and the nights were cool and clear, there lived a tiny mouse named Celestina. She didn't live in a field or a house, but in a small, cool crack in an old adobe wall that bordered a vast, quiet desert. Celestina was a weaver, but she did not use wool or cotton. She was a magical weaver, and her threads were the last shimmering wisps of the day's heat. All day, while the sun was high and the air wiggled and shimmered with heat, Celestina would rest deep in the cool darkness of her crack in the wall. But as the sun began to set, painting the desert in colors of orange, pink, and deep purple, her work began. She would come out with a tiny basket woven from desert grass and her needle, a single, sharp, sturdy needle from a fallen cactus, polished smooth by the wind. Her first task was to gather her thread. She would scurry to the top of the wall and watch the horizon. As the sun disappeared, you could see the air itself begin to cool down. The last bits of the day's heat would rise from the sand and the stones in faint, shimmering, almost invisible ribbons. To most, this was nothing, but to Celestina, this was her precious material. With quick, deft movements, she would catch these shimmering, warm wisps in her basket. They had no weight at all, but she could feel their warmth. She would gather hundreds of them until her basket was full of the captured essence of a warm, sunny day. Then, she would scurry back to her workspace on a large, flat stone that was still warm from the sun, and she would begin to weave. She took the first shimmering thread of heat from her basket. It was so light it tried to float away, but she was quick. She threaded it through the eye of her cactus needle, and her slow, rhythmic work began. In goes the needle, out goes the needle. Pull the shimmering thread through. The magic was in her paws. As she wove, her touch transformed the hot, shimmery thread into a cool, soft, dark blue thread, the color of the desert sky at midnight. Swoosh went the needle through the growing fabric. A tiny, soft sigh. That was the sound of the day's heat turning into the night's cool. She worked with a peaceful, steady rhythm. One stitch, then another. Swoosh, sigh. A row of 10 stitches, then 100. She was weaving a small square of fabric, a patch for a much larger project. As she wove, she hummed a little tune, a song taught to her by the quiet desert wind. Slowly, the patch grew, and as she wove, she thought the pictures of the desert night into the fabric. In one patch, she wove the image of a silent, sleeping lizard, curled on a stone that had finally cooled under the moon. She wove its shape with threads of a slightly darker blue. Swoosh, sigh, a stitch for its tail. Swoosh, sigh, a stitch for its sleeping eye. When that patch was done, she started another. This time, she gathered threads of heat that had risen from the sweet desert flowers. As she wove these, they turned into a soft, lavender-colored thread. With this, she wove the image of a single, beautiful moonflower, opening its petals silently to the night sky. The work was slow. It took a long time just to weave the shape of one petal. But Celestina was never in a rush. The night was long and peaceful. She wove a patch that showed the crescent moon, using the palest, most silvery threads she could find. She wove a patch that showed the shape of a tall, silent cactus, standing like a lonely guardian watching over the sleeping sands. Each patch was a tiny story, a tiny piece of the desert's deep, quiet peace. As she worked, a final bit of magic would happen. Every so often, a tiny spark from a shooting star, a piece of leftover starlight, would drift down from the heavens. Celestina would stop her weaving and hold her breath. If she was lucky, the tiny glittering spark would land upon her growing fabric. With a very careful stitch, she would weave the spark right into the quilt. And from then on, that spot would hold a tiny real star, which would pulse with a gentle, soft, steady light. Glow, fade, glow, fade. Night after night, Celestina worked. She gathered the day's heat and wove it into the night's cool. She stitched the quiet stories of the desert into her fabric. She caught the falling stars and made them a part of her creation. Finally, after many nights of peaceful, rhythmic work, the quilt was finished. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue and lavender, big enough to cover a small child, and dotted all across its surface were dozens of tiny, real stars, all pulsing with a soft, gentle light, like a field of captured fireflies. Her weaving was done, but her work was not. She carefully folded the precious, star-stitched quilt. It was cool to the touch and as light as a whisper. She pushed it ahead of her, out of the desert and towards the window of a little house where a child was tossing and turning, too hot and too restless to sleep. With a final, mighty push, she slid the quilt through the open window. It floated down, a soft blanket of coolness and quiet, and settled gently over the sleeping child. The child instantly stopped fidgeting. The coolness of the quilt soothed their skin. Their eyes, even in sleep, were mesmerized by the gentle, pulsing light of the stitched-in stars. The child sighed a deep, peaceful sigh, much like the sound of Celestina's weaving, and sank into a deep, comfortable, and peaceful sleep, dreaming of the quiet desert and its vast starry sky. Celestina, her work complete, scurried back to her cool crack in the wall, ready to rest through the day and gather more threads tomorrow.